Have you ever just been living your life and you're hit with an emergency expense? And then you feel stressed because you don't have the money for it, worry that you're not going to be able to find the money for it, and fear that you're just going to get deeper into the hole that you're already in? Well, that's pretty bad, but what if an opportunity comes your way and you just don't have the money to take it? At that point, do you feel FOMO and start thinking to yourself that I'll never get ahead? Well, all these negative emotions that you're experiencing are part of your monetary insecurity. And if this is you, don't worry about it. You're watching this video, you want to do something about it, so you're in the right place. But this is a very common situation in America. In 2015, the American Psychological Association and the Federal Reserve produced reports saying that 75% of millennials, 76% of Gen Xers, and 77% of parents are stressed about money. They also found that 31% of adults are struggling to get by or living paycheck to paycheck. And astoundingly, 46% of adults could not cover a $400 emergency expense, or would cover the cost by selling something or borrowing. Now, when I first heard these statistics, I was flabbergasted. I couldn't imagine that to be true because we live in one of the most wealthiest societies in the world and also one of the most wealthiest times in history. It just didn't make any sense that so many people were stressed out about money. But then I thought more about it and I realized that, well, I had never been taught anything about personal finance in school. I didn't get any classes in high school. It wasn't part of the general education in college. So how are people supposed to know about it? Everything that I learned about personal finance was from self-study on the internet for the past 5 years. And even there's a lot of contradictory information and just plain old bad advice. So in a way, it makes sense. I think there's a deeper reason for why we don't have any financial literacy education as required in our society, but that's a topic for another video. So if you're in this situation, don't worry about it. It's not uncommon. And since you're watching this video, I know that you want to change this about yourself. But I want you to know right here and right now that introducing a budget to the situation is gonna delete all of these negative emotions that you experience. It's gonna make you a more happier person because when an emergency comes along, you're gonna be able to take care of it just like that. And when an opportunity comes your way, you'll be able to jump on it and let it take you to new heights. Now, if you hear the word budget and you get scared and want to run away, I want you to know that it's a very simple word. And let me just show you how simple it is. It's a 6-letter word made up of 4 consonants and 2 vowels. If you want a second opinion on how to say it, here's the Google lady.
Budget.
The word budget has an Oxford English Corpus rank of 1058. So it's a very commonly used word, and I'm going to guess you've probably heard it before. You may have heard of this budget before as well, but this is a car rental company. We are not going to be discussing this budget today. Towards the end of this video, however, I will show you how you can make the simplest budget ever. If you're like me and love simplicity, you're going to like this. You are never going to find a more simple budget any place, anywhere, at any time. It is the simplest budget you will ever see. And it's something that I finally developed after 4 years of budgeting. So to begin, I want you to think of yourself for a moment here as a business. And I don't mean that you run a business or that you have a business, but that you yourself as a person are a business. The income that you make from your job is your business income. The food and beer and rent and utilities that you pay for are your business expenses, right? So if somebody comes along and asks you, hey business, what's your cash flow? And you're like, I don't know what that is. What's cash flow? I have no clue. Then congratulations, you are a shitty business. And shitty businesses don't stay around for that long. Shitty businesses declare bankruptcy. Nobody wants to do business with a shitty business. And most people in America are shitty businesses. Remember the statistics that we just looked at. Most people are stressed about money. 1/3 of them are living paycheck to paycheck, and nearly half of them don't even have an emergency fund that has $400 in it. So what that means is most people's money situation looks something like this. They have a certain amount of money coming in, and a greater amount of money going out. They spend more than they make. They're in debt. They're going deeper into debt. They're digging themselves into a hole that is going to be harder and harder to come back out of the older they get. And if this is you, when you start your budget, you're going to see that two things will happen. You're going to cut your expenses because that's what any good business will do. And then you're going to be motivated to go out and make more money to grow your money inflow. That is what is going to put you back in business. That is going to put you on the path to building wealth. This is the point where your financial future changes for the better. Now, when people get excited about budgeting and they're all motivated to start budgeting, the first question that they ask usually kills them right in their tracks. And that question is, which budgeting tool shall I use? And the reason why most people die here is because there are just so many different options that you can use to start a budget. There's automatic tools. You can do it manually. You can even use envelopes, actual envelopes. And when people see all their options, they start going online and seeing the research that other people have done. And they spend a lot of time just reading about what budget is the best, but never actually start budgeting. Then you go to YouTube and want to look at budget reviews there, get distracted by the unrelated but funny suggested video, and before you know it, the day is over and you've lost all the motivation and you say, all right, well, I'm just going to start budgeting tomorrow. So I want you to just forget about all that stuff, because the true answer is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what tool you use, whether you build your own budget in Excel or buy a software that does it automatically for you. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you start. And a good rule of thumb for this is that when you hear the word budget, whatever product comes to mind, that's the one that you should start with. You can always change it later. But since you're here, I'm going to recommend you to look into YNAB, or You Need a Budget. This is the budgeting tool that I've been using for the past 4 years, and it has been amazing. I've gotten so much out of this tool that it's well worth the small investment up front. And if you're looking at this and you see, oh man, $84, I don't know if I can pay $84 for a budgeting tool. Well, if you can't pay $84 for something that's going to improve your life drastically, then you need a budget. 4 years ago, when I was starting to budget, there were two products that came to my mind. The first was Mint, and that was because I had used it before in college. The second was YNAB, because a friend had recommended it to me. What appealed to me about Mint was that it was free. YNAB was not free. And young, frugal me was always looking to build things myself and not pay for anything, especially something that was just basically a fancier version of Excel. Mint also had some other cool features like bill pay and a free credit score, but I ended up ultimately going with YNAB on this decision, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But first, I'll tell you why I ended up not liking Mint. And the first reason is that it tries to be too helpful. And what I mean by this is that it doesn't ask you for your input enough, so eventually you feel like you're not in control of your budget. I think the idea behind the end user experience of Mint was a budgeting tool that the user barely had to touch. So you set up Mint, connect all your accounts, and then let it go for the month, and then at the end, come and look at what you'd spent. Mint would categorize all your transactions automatically and give you a nice looking report at the end of the month. But it doesn't always work as well as advertised. And here's someone who can explain it better than I can.
So the first app I want to talk about is for budgeting, and the app that I use for that is called Mint. This is your very classic budgeting app, and it's very simple. You link your credit card accounts and you link your bank accounts, and for a while I didn't set up any budgets for myself, because one cool feature about this app is that it will actually suggest budgets for you. Now, you have to pay attention to where it's lumping your charges. Let's say I went to a gas station and I had to pick up some deodorant because I left deodorant at home, or I forgot to put it on that day or something. It's gonna budget you something for gas stations because it's gonna lump that deodorant purchase into your gas budget because it came from the 7-Eleven or whatever. So you sort of have to go in and manually reallocate your charges sometimes based on where you bought things to get a true picture. Because it's not so sophisticated that it knows what every store type is. Just a heads up for you there.
And just to add on to that, you're going to have to remember that you bought deodorant at the gas station. If you're coming in a week later and updating your budget, Mint is not going to tell you that, hey, you spent an abnormally small amount at the gas station the other day. Is this right? You're going to have to first remember that you bought deodorant at the gas station and then go ahead and recategorize it manually. And I can understand why the user experience of Mint is not as good as some other tools, because Mint is not Intuit's main product. Intuit sells a host of other software to personal and business users. Mint is a free tool that Intuit provides to consumers to try to get them to buy other software and services like tax preparation. But although it's free, they gotta make money off of it somehow. And that's the third reason that I don't really like Mint. It advertises to you. And sometimes the advertising is really sneaky and they don't really call it advertising. So again, here's somebody who can explain it better than I can.
Now, the last problem that I have with Mint, which I haven't really seen in other apps, is the amount of advertising. Now, I will go in and check my net worth statement, which is the only thing I really use Mint for, and I automatically get a section in the app called advice. Now, when you hear advice, you think, oh, this app is going to show me some ways that I can sort of do better and get ahead with this whole financial goal that I have in mind. And what I got was a lot different from what I would expect. So I'll put up one of their advice sections on the screen now. So that's an advertisement for a place called Lending Club. They basically allow you to take out a loan at a lower interest rate than most places in order to help you consolidate the debt that you have at higher interest rates, or to pay off really large sums of money that have slightly higher interest rates like student loans, debt consolidation, things like that. So when I see that on a budgeting app like Mint that is supposed to help you get a hold of your finances, and I see that they're recommending as advice that you could potentially get 40 grand to do all these great things that help your money situation, they don't take into account that this lender obviously is going to be willing to give you money for other things as well. Now, I don't know that much about Lending Club. I don't know that, what their turn down rate is or what they take into consideration. But the fact that they even have that as categories is what bothers me, because it doesn't lend to practical, sound financial advice, especially when you see it on a budgeting app. So my fear is that people who aren't good with their finances, who saw this app for the first time and heard that it could help you sort of get momentum, are going to see that as advice. They're going to take it literally. They're going to go to Lending Club and they're going to use that extra money to do something else that they probably shouldn't get involved in the first place. And they're not going to really treat that money as debt, because they're going to feel like they just accomplished something when really they've just moved the debt around. And I think that that's what's not being driven home, is that debt is debt. The interest rate, sure, has an impact, but it's still debt that you have. So essentially, I feel like Mint is treating symptoms and not the problem.
And that's exactly right. The point of your budget should be to get out of debt, not take on more debt. Remember that the internet is full of bad advice I was telling you earlier? Yeah. So YNAB, on the other hand, ended up being a much better tool for me. And after 4 years of using it, I'll tell you why. First of all, it forces you to know thyself financially. Whereas Mint tries to be too helpful and automatically categorize your transactions, YNAB makes you look in the mirror and see exactly where your money is going. And if you're like me, who in the past I would spend money just unconsciously, like walking down the street, see a store, go into the store, see something I like, and then buy it. And then a couple days later, forget all about the thing that I bought. It was really useful because I would see that transaction show up a couple days later. And then I would have to remember, oh yeah, I did go to that store and buy that thing, but where is it now? I completely forgot. So YNAB is going to basically force you to know yourself better. And it does help a little bit with that because it learns based on what you categorize things as. So for example, if you buy deodorant at the gas station, it may still categorize the transaction as a gas transaction, but it does make you approve the transaction. So even if you forgot about it, when you see the transaction, the $5 transaction at the gas station, you'll remember that you just bought deodorant and not gas, and you can categorize it appropriately. Something that I really liked about YNAB when I started using it was that it was built on a method. And that's why I would recommend it to first-time budgeters, because if you're going to use YNAB, you're going to have to learn how to budget effectively. They have tutorial videos, they do webinars, and they have a great customer support staff. So if you have questions about how to budget, they will help you. Now, I used the method for quite a while, but in the last year, I stopped using it. And the reason for that is that, well, I just know myself already. I've gotten to a point where I've overcome the unconscious spending that using the method doesn't really help me anymore. And the nice thing about YNAB is that it doesn't force you to use the method. And finally, it's the company's only product. So all the people that are working for YNAB are spending their days trying to make it a better product. Because if they don't make it good enough, then people are going to start leaving and going to other tools. So if you don't like it, well, it's really their loss. So at the end of the day, I ended up going with YNAB and not Mint. Now, there is one thing that I do want to tell you at this point, and that is don't reinvent the budget. If you're like me and you think, well, a budget is just basically a fancy version of Excel, I can go and make my own budget, I don't have to spend money on something like that, then you might be tempted to do it. Don't. I mean, you can do it if you want, of course, but I urge you to not try to reinvent the budget like I did. This was the first budget that I created. I made it in Excel. It had macros. It had scripts to be able to run reports. It was very prone to errors. It was very difficult to maintain. And every time I spent money, I felt like I was George keeping track of all these receipts for everything. And the funny thing is that I probably spent more time building this budget than actually using it. After about 2 weeks of using this, I realized that it's not going to work out and I should just scrap it. So after that, I went ahead and bought YNAB. Don't be one of those guys that gets too caught up in the DIY thing that you forego some good advice that you're getting because you think you're too good for already made products. Don't be that guy. Don't be me then. So when you decide what tool you want to use for your budget, the next question becomes how to set it up. Well, for this, there's honestly not an easy question because everybody's going to want to set it up a little bit differently. So the only thing that I can do here in this case is to show you what I've done, and hopefully you can learn a couple things from my stupidity. So I'm going to show you the first budget that I made, then what I did when I realized that wasn't going to work, and finally the simplest budget ever, the one that I use today. So this is the first budget that I ever put together. And as you can see, I kind of went overboard on the specificity of the categories. For example, in the food category, I have groceries, but then I also have milk and eggs. Because as you can see, I spent a lot of money on milk and eggs. Workday lunches was different from dining out. I had a whole category group for my car, but when I sold my car in 2017, I realized that I needed some other categories to cover the cost of cars that I borrowed and whatnot. So there's a whole bunch of categories right there, but that's not even the worst part. There's more. And there were a couple things about this budget that made me realize that it wasn't going to work long term. For the first part, there was a lot of categories that I had had 1 year, but never used the second. The reverse was also true. And then there were categories that I didn't use at all, even though I had set them up. And finally, I was maintaining a category called Stuff I Forgot About. And I have no idea what's in there. I don't know if it's necessary or discretionary or whatever. But it just didn't make sense to have a budget where there was so much complexity and ambiguity. So that wasn't going to work. I went back to thinking about what the purpose of the budget was. First off, I want to know my cash flow. Second off, I want to get out of debt. And third, I wanted to have an emergency fund with 6 to 12 months of expenses. So when I look back at my budget, I saw that there was a column that sort of helped me accomplish this. A necessary or discretionary column. Necessary expenses were things that I would have to spend money on no matter what happened. but discretionary spending could be cut. So if I knew those things, I could build an appropriate emergency fund. But instead of doing the smart thing, I instead created a budget based on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when I first started out, I thought, yeah, this is going to be a pretty cool thing. It's a nice concept. There are categories that fall into each of these sections of the pyramid. And my goal would be to allocate probably the most amount of money into self-actualization there at the top. But this budget ended up breaking down pretty quickly. For the first part, it was hard to actually use the YNAB method for this. So I ended up creating a separate category group for things that I wanted to save up money for. And what brought me back to reality was when I had to set up a category for transactions that didn't fit anywhere else. At that point, I knew that this was not going to work. So after about 2 or 3 months of doing that, I shut it down and went back to the purpose of my budget. And I added one more thing on top of this, which was to keep it simple. I wanted to keep it so simple that a caveman could do it. And what came out of this exercise was the simplest budget imaginable. Like I said, this is the simplest budget you're ever going to see. You are not going to find a simpler budget anywhere else. The category groups that I came up with were necessary OPEX, discretionary OPEX, and CAPEX. And then I also wanted to just track how much money I was actually saving, and that's something I had not done in my budget before. So I created a category for investment. And these are not expenses per se, because I'm just moving money out of my checking account to an investment account, but it was a nice way of keeping track of how much I was investing. And I also had the classic do not track category. I don't want these things to affect my personal expenses. Now, after I had gone through the exercise, stood up from my chair and looked at what I had written on the paper, I thought, this is too simple. This is not going to work. Somehow or in some way, it's just going to fall apart. But 7 months after I started this budget, I have not had to add any categories. It has been bulletproof. It's been flawless. And it has been just amazingly simple. And it's super self-explanatory, so I don't have to talk about it anymore. I don't have to explain it anymore. You see this, you can set it up, and you can just do it. But since we're here, might as well. So here's a report of my spending from January to May of this year. I can see the total amount that I've spent and how much I've spent in each of the 3 different categories. In the necessary OPEX section, I have things that are, necessary, like rent, utilities, groceries, debts, bus passes, stationery. And of course you might think some of these are, not actually necessary, like soap or vitamins, but I'd consider those things that I wouldn't want to live without, even if I didn't have any income. Discretionary OPEX is things that I could cut down on in the event of a financial emergency. I don't have to overpay my debts, go out to eat, spend money on entertainment, taxi rides, or subscriptions or memberships. And in CAPEX, I put expenses that do come up once in a while, but are not repeating on a regular basis. So if I buy a course, buy somebody some gifts, donate money, or just buy an item here or there, that would go into CAPEX. And so one of the things that the budget is going to help you do is create an emergency fund for yourself. And that's one of the first things that you'll do after you know how much you're spending each month. Here's a monthly report of my budget that shows January through April and then the average and total. So the first milestone that I have for my emergency fund is to get 6 months of necessary OPEX. So I just take the average amount that I've spent in that category, multiply by 6, and there I have it. That's my target emergency fund balance. Once I get that, I can move to milestone 2, which is 12 months of necessary OPEX. And finally, it's always good to have some extra cash on hand in case, an opportunity comes up. So I'm going to set a milestone 3 of 12 months of total OPEX. So if an opportunity does come up, I won't have to forego it due to a financial reason. So that's the simplest budget. And that's what I'm using. And it's still going solid. No changes necessary, even after 7 months. So I hope you enjoy seeing what I have done and that you can learn from my stupidity and get a head start on your budget and start in a better position than I was in 4 years ago. So now what I want you to do is to go and pick a tool and set up your budget. And remember that it doesn't matter what tool that you use, because it's better to have a tool and no budget than a budget and no tool. I don't know if that makes any sense, but whatever. Now, whether you choose to do your budget manually or use a software that pulls in transactions automatically, I want you to schedule 10 minutes every 3 days to categorize transactions. This is going to be your most basic budget maintenance. If you're going to use a software that pulls in transactions automatically from your bank account, credit card, or debit card, then 10 minutes is definitely overkill. 3 days is a good amount of time because the purchases that you made are still fresh in your head. And thirdly, I want you to let me know what you learned about yourself. Like I said earlier, one thing that I learned about myself was that I was spending money unconsciously before I started budgeting. And my budget forced me to see what I was doing and what I was spending money on and basically who I was. It was a very eye-opening experience for me. And that's all for today, folks. And remember, to start a budget, that's 1-800-GO-BUDGET. That's 1-800-GO-BUDGET, or find us on the web at www.budget.com.